Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the End Your Hiring Headache webinar. My name is Ian Christic, and I'm a solutions consultant at the Myers Briggs Company. This webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending out an email with a link to the recording and the slides within the next few days. Today's webinar will run for approximately 1 hour, so please feel free to submit any questions using the question function at any time. Our goal today is to discuss some new and emerging pain points related to selecting and developing the right talent for your organization. We then want to touch on an easy yet scientifically proven approach to alleviate these pain points using the CPI, the California Psychological Inventory 260 assessment. We're not going to be able to cover everything the assessment can do in just 1 hour, but we'd love to talk to you more about it and about your specific needs that we can help you with. Now, I'm happy to introduce our speaker, Dr. Justin Arneson, Senior Research and Data Scientist at the Myers Briggs Company. And Justin is a learning development professional with 12 years of experience applying behavioral science to solve workplace challenges. And over the course of his career, he's designed and developed and implemented human capital system components, including such things as pre-hire assessments and employee engagement initiatives, performance management systems, and leadership development programs. He's also published research in journals such as the Psychological Bulletin and Psychological Science, and he's presented research findings at professional conferences. He's also the principal architect of the Association for Talent Development's 2013 update to its competency model, defining the training and development profession. He's offered several technical briefs and white papers on our assessment offerings, and he earned his PhD in industrial and organizational psychology from the University of Minnesota. And so with that, I'll hand it over to you, Justin.
Okay, thank you, Ian. And thank you to all of you who've carved out some time from your busy schedules to attend this webinar. My apologies in advance for the state of my voice. But as Ian can attest, it's leaps and bounds better than it was last week. So hopefully it's more painful for me than it is for you to listen to, and we'll plow through today. So as Ian mentioned, we're here today to discuss some core talent challenges you're likely facing in your business, or if you're listening as a consultant, the challenges you likely see in your client organizations. I'm then going to focus on some tools for addressing these challenges, and along the way I'll be asking some questions of the group. So I certainly encourage you to contribute, because the perspectives that you offer can provide a good benchmark for others listening to judge their own practices. Also, and this kind of dovetails with something I'll talk about a little bit later, I just want to take care of some housekeeping up front. We certainly have a diverse group of attendees in terms of job titles. We have people with backgrounds in talent management, learning and development, human capital, talent acquisition, and the list kind of goes on from there. These functions all generally fit within the human resource function. So for simplicity's sake, I'm going to refer to everyone in this space as HR professionals or HR practitioners, just to kind of keep things simple on my side. So to kind of jump in and get you engaged with a question right off the bat, I'm interested in a quick poll here about who has had an open position to fill in the last 6 months. And you can see in your go-to box, there'll be a poll open, and we're going to take a few seconds and look at those results.
And we're getting a lot of responses here, Justin, so that's great. Looks like everyone's able to find the pull buttons to respond.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and not surprisingly, and likely because you're here, we see that about 70% of you have had a position to fill in the last 6 months. So hopefully, well, unfortunately, a lot of the things that I'm talking about in terms of headaches and roadblocks are likely things that you've experienced, but hopefully you'll be able to gain some insight and some actionable takeaways from today. So Given this, before I get into some of these major roadblocks in identifying talent and developing talent, I want to talk about what I'm not going to talk about. So I'm intentionally avoiding any discussion, or I wouldn't say necessarily any discussion, but most discussion of the impact of disruptive technologies and how they'll affect our central question or our central focus today. So certainly, in recent years, it's become nearly impossible to avoid media headlines or thought leader commentaries or industry reports that fixate on impending dramatic changes to to our economy that will be brought on by things like artificial intelligence and automation and the like. Um, and it's certainly interesting and worthwhile to speculate on how such a world will affect the workforce of the future. And I certainly don't want to ignore or discount these important issues. Uh, However, I'll contend that for most of you out there and for most HR practitioners in general, the fundamental human capital challenges that we're facing on a day-to-day basis have yet to be meaningfully affected by these macro level disruptive technologies. Instead, you're more likely facing challenges that have been influenced by subtle changes in the talent landscape that have slowly emerged over the last decade or so. So with that in mind, I'm going to focus on a few uh, very core talent-related pain points that we hope to will resonate with your experience. And then I'll talk about some strategies for mitigating these issues, um, none of which involve using artificial intelligence to select and develop your workforce of the future. So basic and simple question is, why is finding the right talent so difficult? It's not a stretch for me to say that for all those who responded to the poll question, that you likely encountered quite a few challenges along the way. Even though I'm going to zero in on a few critical pain points, I certainly recognize that there are a huge number of challenges out there. And in order to get a feel for the diversity of these challenges, I want to follow up now with um, just an open question to you about the specific challenges that you faced when you've tried to fill those open positions. So I'm going to pause again for a second and let you type some thoughts into the questions box on the control panel. And as we accumulate some of those, Ian can kind of summarize what you write. We can see what issues you're facing in finding talent. Ian, are you seeing any trends or anything in particular to call out?
Yeah, I am. So a couple of trends here. Um, Finding a qualified person basically finding qualified talent, position description, um, how to integrate local recruitment with global possibilities as well, how to evaluate soft skills like emotional intelligence and adaptability, um, or some other questions coming through. And then for those in maybe smaller companies, challenging and finding talent and competing with large companies. Yeah, so a lot of good questions coming through.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. And fortunately, several of those dovetail very nicely with some of the things that we're going to zero in on today. So I appreciate your input there. So, clearly talent selection feels like an uphill battle, and it will remain an uphill battle. For today's purposes, I'm going to focus on three kind of key roadblocks to finding the right talent and developing talent that we as an organization, as the Myers Briggs Company and others, such as the World Economic Forum and McKinsey and Company, have identified that stand out as talent roadblocks. So what are these three? So put very simply, I'm going to focus on low unemployment, unique jobs and roles, which I think is a question that jumped out on the previous slide, and then also expert or kind of more savvy interviewees. So again, these are the primary roadblocks I'm going to focus on. Obviously, there are plenty of additional headwinds affecting the field, but we're going to dive into these. So, low unemployment to start with, they're just simply for a large number of jobs, there isn't a huge pool of candidates out there vying for a single position, which raises, a lot of challenges in being able to identify the best of that candidate pool, which is very small. Uh, just for perspective, when I last looked recently, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported an overall unemployment rate of about 3.5%. And that number gets even lower as you look at management populations, where we're down to about 1.8%, and professional populations, where we're looking at about 1.7%. So the talent is not knocking on your door in most cases. And then an additional kind of area I want to focus on is that, there's this notion out there that younger generations, and I hate to say it, but I'll use the word millennials, that millennials are more likely to job hop today than generations of the past. But if you actually look at the numbers, the average tenure of millennials in a particular job is the same as that we witnessed in the early 80s. So essentially, our younger workers historically have kind of kept their options open and kept their eyes open to new opportunities. Another kind of common myth is that older workers or more experienced workers are more loyal to organizations and unlikely to seek out new opportunities later in their careers, and either due to risk aversion or just because of a generational focus on remaining loyal to your organization. And while certainly older workers tend to stay in their positions longer, several results have indicated that they are certainly not averse to changing jobs, especially if they're not engaged or if they're not supported in their workplace. And again, if the right opportunity presents itself. So just wanted to correct a couple of those misconceptions. But even accounting for this willingness to job hop, that main point of low unemployment still stands. Most qualified candidates already comfortably hold jobs, and even if they're passively open to new opportunities, coaxing them into your organization and convincing them to stay may take some extra work and resources on your part. Since they're not actively applying to open positions, you're going to have to be proactive in building up your candidate pool and seek out prospective candidates through things like personal connections, industry forums, and social platforms like LinkedIn and the like. And so it's certainly a lot more difficult landscape out there in trying to pinpoint talent. Now on to the second role, which is becoming more and more pervasive, or the second roadblock that's becoming more and more pervasive. So some of you may be familiar with the strong interest inventory, which if you think back to your high school days or early college days, it's an inventory that's often used with students and those early in their career to help identify work interests and kind of fields that might be of interest to them, to their particular skill sets and where their interests lie. And one of the pieces of feedback that we received in recent years as we've collected data around the strong interest inventory is that specific job titles aren't really resonating with younger generations anymore, and they're not conveying much meaning. So instead, we've kind of migrated to focusing on the underlying interests or the underlying skills and characteristics that are relevant to a particular job field, and finding better luck there and helping these younger generations navigate where their interests lie and where they might pursue additional training and work. So this kind of empirical observation that we've found corresponds, of course, to that workforce trend I mentioned about broader job roles rather than clearly defined jobs with clearly defined responsibilities. Even, and maybe especially in smaller and mid-sized organizations, employees are tasked with working cross-functionally these days and may wear a lot of hats. This means that you as HR professionals or consultants are less able to rely on data that has historically been useful for initially screening candidates. And a prime example is that of college degree. As we're not living in a day where a specific college degree maps directly to a job title or a career path. And we're seeing more and more certifications and kind of bite-sized learning classes that will equip candidates with the technical skills, and which further reinforces the need as an employer, as you're selecting people, to focus on what are the soft skills then that are going to add value. So again, I don't want to discount the value of these technical skills and training, and certainly they need to be evaluated in the hiring process, but due to this kind of overarching ambiguity in job roles, it's certainly more important, it becomes more important to understand which core characteristics, such as aspects of personality, which I'll kind of focus on today, but also values and cognitive abilities, are required for success immediately and long-term within your organization. HR is also faced with the critical challenge of determining which of these characteristics are better or easier to buy during the hiring phase, and which are better to build through the post-hire training and development. And so you'll see an overarching theme as I talk today, or as I try to talk today, about HR and HR consulting needing to really critically evaluate a lot of the components of the work that you do in order to maximize the effectiveness of hires, especially in this time where the supply of talent is short. And just to kind of expand on this idea of ambiguous job roles, hopefully this resonates with those of you listening, but I'll selfishly focus on my own role as a data scientist, which is included as a part of my broader role as a researcher on our team. But this is something that is a title that has kind of gotten more popular in years. In the HR world, we often see it translated to people or HR analytics, but I'd be willing to bet that I could ask about 50 subject matter experts to describe the core responsibilities of a data scientist, and I'd get nearly 50 different answers. Some may focus on the importance of understanding statistics and building statistical models to predict things. Others may focus more on the capability to utilize software and programming and those sorts of skills. And still others may focus more on the ability to take all this data that's out there and tell a story with it that can be understood by stakeholders of the business. So the takeaway here is all of these different views on this ambiguous job title have implications for the underlying knowledge, skills, and abilities that are important for you and for your organization. So certainly hiring for many jobs of the future will require careful consideration of these knowledge, skills, and abilities, and again, what can be developed and what is more effectively trained once someone is in the role. And then finally, this is a little bit less critical, but I think it's still a worthwhile point to focus on the impact that technology, especially over the last decade, and no, I didn't say disruptive technology, but just fundamentally, just access to information has had on our interview candidates. So we're in an era in which candidates have access to all kinds of job-related information, and depending on the type of job, so if it's a high-volume job or a particularly popular job, a simple web search can often provide guidance about what to expect during the selection process. Maybe some answers to personality or cognitive ability questionnaires that are administered. In the management and consulting world, candidates can study endless cases to prepare for interviews, and even at higher levels in the organization, experienced candidates can get an idea of what might be involved in an intensive leadership selection process. But despite all this, universally, organizations still rely heavily on in-person interviewing for making final selection decisions or hiring decisions. And we should expect, certainly at a minimum level, that a diligent candidate should do their homework and be well prepared for an interview. So having that technology at their fingertips is advantageous in that regard. However, any access that they have to anecdotes about the types of questions being asked in interviews or competencies that are favored by an organization, or things like that, it can provide a dishonest leg up for candidates. And so, we really have these potentially savvy interviewees that we have to navigate. And this whole issue is also made a little bit murkier by the fact that we have a large body of research evidence in the field that shows that hiring managers overestimate their ability to identify those kind of core competencies that I'm talking about today, that are critical to job success. And these interviewers can easily be influenced by non-job related factors. And so if you have a savvy candidate who's very well prepared and very polished, they can oftentimes sway a hiring decision in their favor, and in ways that may not be reflective of how they're likely to perform on the job. And I don't want this to come across as though interviews aren't important. Um, I just want to emphasize that they do have their role, especially for situations like understanding how an interview comes across in terms of their communication style and characteristics related to interpersonal interactions. But it does kind of emphasize the importance and the need to have multiple lenses on a prospective candidate's likely performance and characteristics before you make a hiring decision. So again, why is hiring so important? Why is finding talent so important? Well, we have those limitations at the front end, and then at the back end, if you don't have a solid system in place, there are certainly some significant implications of hiring the wrong person. And I don't want to paint a picture of too much doom and gloom, but I kind of am. I'm going to do so for a while. So that being said, in practice, most of you and most of your organizations likely have a system in place that generally works. And so, at a baseline, you're getting available talent into open positions, hopefully and ideally in an efficient and cost-effective manner. And if the hiring system was completely dysfunctional, the business itself would not be able to operate. So certainly, we have a baseline level of proficiency that most organizations are operating at. There's plenty of variability around there. And so I want to talk about where there's room for improvement. And we know that especially for smaller and mid-sized organizations, it's difficult to gather the time and the resources to systematically follow up on new hires to ensure that they're hitting the mark. And from a statistical perspective, again, smaller organizations aren't able to build up the numbers where we can draw some statistical conclusions about what kind of pre-hire variables are best influencing performance and retention and culture fit and things like that. So that's a pesky challenge. So instead, since since HR is often not able to follow up and ensure that performance, these effects of consistently not finding an ideal fit for a job can start to be felt organically throughout the business. These poorer performers may be kind of pushed out, and depending on the organizations, the time frame may be quickly, or it may kind of happen slowly. But nonetheless, they'll either be pushed out or they'll see the writing on the wall. And this turnover means that, one, jobs aren't getting done, and I can throw out all kinds of numbers associated with the cost of recruitment and hiring and replacing candidates. But basically, all those obstacles, the practicality is all those obstacles I just talked about to finding the right fit have to be navigated again and again. And so that challenge just kind of compounds itself. And then certainly we're familiar with, the next point, where if you're hiring someone who's not an optimal fit and they stay with your organization for whatever reason, there are certainly negative connotations associated with that. So you may be incentive, or an organization may be incentivized to encourage people to stay so that they don't face these turnover costs. However, a fit, someone who isn't an ideal fit may end up being a toxic influence to your organizational culture, which is something that over time can kind of accumulate. And then even just from a talent and performance perspective, those deficits accumulate over time and ultimately can be felt at the bottom line of an organization. And so, systematically, the implications of hiring the wrong, I should say, people accumulates over time, and kind of regardless of the business, is certainly going to have an impact. So I want to transition now to leadership roles, where basically everything I've talked about previously applies still, but the issues are just, the stakes become even higher. So certainly much of your work and a lot of consulting work in the HR world focuses on cultivating effective leaders. And it's a core focus of many successful organizations. However, in reality, what we consistently find, and what a lot of research supports, is that basically the leadership domain itself is really oversaturated. And so decision makers kind of don't know where to turn and where to go and where to look for advice. And ultimately where this ends up is that critical decision makers end up having a picture in their mind of what a good leader looks like, or what a good leader is like, but they have difficulty articulating a concrete and standardized definition of effective leadership. And so we've often heard, the explanation that good leadership is like good art. You just know it when you see it. So, this shortcoming in evaluating talent is similar to what I talked about in the interview process, where, sometimes we're not fully equipped to make these judgments about where talent and potential lies. So obviously, the Myers Briggs Company, being that we're in this business, we have our own perspective on leadership and effective leadership. And so that could be a whole different discussion. I'm going to stick just to the basics here. And fundamentally, at the basic level, effective leaders do two things. They establish a vision and direction for their team as a whole, and they demonstrate concern and support for individual team members. And this can, look a lot like a lot of different things, and this can, take a lot of different turns in different organizations. Certainly leadership is a complex topic, which is why it's a big business, and it's why many organizations and HR consultants are able to put their own spin on it. Nonetheless, 80 years of research has demonstrated that fundamentally those two concepts of creating a vision and then supporting your team members are fundamental. So here, I'd like to pause, and I gave away kind of the punchline on screen here, but I'm interested in another poll question getting at what percentage of leaders in your organization do you consider to be effective? I'll pause here, and you can hop back on that poll, and we'll see what we see. Ian, do you want to kind of break down? I think it looks like things are leveling out a bit here.
Yeah, it looks like it's a bit of a bell curve here. We've got about 38% of respondents saying 25 to 50%, and 32% saying about 50 to 75%.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So that certainly corresponds to the point I've noted up here, which is that as many of 2/3 of leaders are often viewed as not necessarily performing effectively. Uh, and clearly you're seeing that in your own organizations. Um, excuse me. So as I mentioned, based on the basic conception of leadership that I've talked about, leadership performance is certainly lacking in a lot of cases, and so that 2/3 of leaders being viewed as incompetent reflects both in achieving objectives, in accomplishing that vision that we talked about, and also in engaging their team. So 2/3 of these leaders are failing to meet the performance objectives that have been laid out for them, but they're also considered not to be fully competent by their team. So while selecting and promoting the wrong leaders has all the cost implications that we talked about earlier, those implications are magnified given, again, the smaller talent pool that we're working from, a more competitive talent pool, and then the larger just span of control offered by leadership roles, even down to the team leader level. But at that level, you can a toxic leader or an ineffective leader or a leader that doesn't model the characteristics of the culture of an organization can have a cascading negative influence on team engagement and performance. And so certainly this doesn't paint a great picture of leadership today. And I also want to point out, and this certainly is something that has crossed your mind in the HR world, but selecting the right leader isn't only critical for reinforcing the culture of an organization, but these leaders also serve critical roles for you in terms of being your talent scouts on the ground. By ensuring that leaders model expected behaviors and are also able to accurately identify talent within their own business units, they're able to help contribute to a robust talent culture and help you in HR develop a solid talent pool and talent pipeline. So hiring effective leaders has a direct impact on your job. Okay. Oops. So I'm going to kind of step back from my focus on that doom and gloom, we'll stop these dominoes from falling, and focus a little more on what we can do to find the right talent for your organization. The question becomes, given these challenges I've talked about and the challenges that you indicated in the poll, how can you improve your odds of finding the right person for the job? So I'm going to focus specifically on assessment and the role that assessment can play, given our limited time frame here. So, certainly there are a large number of approaches and opportunities out there for that attempt to tackle this problem of identifying the right talent and making sure it's the right fit for your organization. Assessments, I think, provide a good additional data point and additional lens for informing hiring decisions, and also they provide data that downstream can help in the leadership development realm. So it provides data that helps throughout the employee life cycle. Just a little bit more about the CPI 260 for some background. It's a comprehensive personality assessment that provides information about 29 easy to understand characteristics that can be used by decision makers to help predict performance, culture fit, and retention. In addition to this kind of comprehensive perspective provided by the CPI, it ensures that you can hone in on critical aspects of personality, even as the nature of work changes or new concepts and trends become popular. I like to think that even though our world is changing fast, the fundamental characteristics of people have essentially remained the same. And we've done a good job historically of measuring those fundamental characteristics. So for a concrete example, I want to focus on a current kind of popular trend of growth mindset. So this is something that likely has come across some of your news feeds or across your desk or in conversations that you've had, but growth mindset has really risen to popularity. I would say even just this year, well, we're early into 2020, so I would say throughout most of 2019 even, um, and has really dominated the management literature and popular press. And this has been in large part because of Microsoft, which is generally a respected organization. They've really marketed their efforts to embrace growth mindset in their company culture, and they've talked a lot about the benefits that have resulted from it. And I would contend that this rise in popularity of this issue in particular of growth mindset can be viewed as a byproduct of the roadblock I talked about earlier, emphasizing the ambiguity of job roles. So the idea is that with growth mindset, organizations need employees who are continually striving to develop and adapt to this rapidly changing work environment and to this ambiguous work environment. But fundamentally, it turns out that the CPI already does a pretty darn good job of measuring the characteristics associated with growth mindset. So the CPI has specific scales that assess flexibility and achievement orientation, and focusing on characteristics such as these can help foster a learning culture in your organization and increase the likelihood that new hires will be open to and pursue professional development. So ultimately, my conclusion here is, this is a growth mindset is trendy and has grabbed the attention of the popular press, but fundamentally, it's something that we've been able to measure and we can measure well. Uh, and this poses kind of an ongoing challenge in the HR world, whether you're a consultant or whether you're in practice or a practitioner within an organization. Um, because if your senior management or if your managers are fixated or focused on some of these trends, you have to walk that line between either educating them about how they relate to systems you may currently have in place, or how they relate to systems that are in place, like I just did, or maybe a matter of reframing things such that, looking at the CPI 260, saying, hey, we can address growth mindset through the CPI 260. So, these are considerations that you have to take based on your own organizational dynamic. So I'm going to take a few minutes to expand on the CPI and just the value that it offers, in part because we're obviously asked many times, what makes the CPI any different than all the other assessments on the market? And in your fields, you're certainly inundated with, the latest and greatest in technology and assessment and all of that. Oftentimes with very little data around the outcomes of applying those assessments. And so I could go on and on about why the CPI is a good choice, but I'm going to focus on a few things in particular. So one key differentiator is that while a lot of personality assessments focus on an understanding of self, after all, who knows more about you than yourself? Which is an important approach in many contexts. For example, the Myers Briggs type indicator, or MBTI, emphasizes self and other awareness and is really effective for things like having a common language for communicating with your team. The CPI is distinguished in that it focuses on how others perceive you, something that we commonly refer to as our reputation. So reputation is particularly important at work. If you think about your managerial style, if you think your own managerial style is warm and inviting, and that's your self perspective, but your team is hesitant to ask questions because they see you as coming across as very task focused, this gap, this blind spot between your reputation and perceived self can really impact how you interact with your team and how your team performs. And as a concrete example, you know, I was once actually providing some coaching feedback to a leader whose CPI results suggested that they might react defensively to critical performance feedback or developmental performance feedback. And this was a characteristic that was very much valued by the organization I was with. And if you think about it, it's a concept that's not too far divorced from this idea of growth mindset, and that the intent is to facilitate ongoing growth and development. And this was 10 years ago. So with this particular candidate, as I posed this potential opportunity for self-development, they immediately became defensive, and they were adamant that they took feedback in stride, and that was actually a strength of theirs. And it was hard for me to kind of hold in the hypocrisy there, but there was clearly a disconnect between that person's self-awareness and self-perspective and their reputation. And so that's a key differentiator of the CPI. Another advantage of the CPI comes in part due to the care taken in its development, and the ongoing just volumes of data that we've been able to collect over its 60 years of use. So we have a huge pool of evidence indicating that the assessment predicts performance and potential across a range of jobs and in leadership roles in particular. And also for decision making and professional development purposes, all that data we've collected also allows you at your organizational level to compare scores that you may see within your organization to those typically seen for individuals in that industry or at that level. So it's really good. We provide some really good benchmarking data. And then finally, you know, as a researcher, I don't want to get too anecdotal, but have to put in a shameless plug that a few years ago, a Business Insider journalist took the CPI, went through the feedback process, and really focused on leadership development. And the feedback really resonated with them, and they wrote a great article about how the CPI was a freakishly accurate assessment of their leadership gaps and of their strengths. And then they kind of talked about how that played out on the job. So with that, I'm going to transition into away from the selection side of things and into the leadership development side of things. So taking a step back, let's think of a future world. I guess that would be taking steps forward, but let's think about a future world in which you've incorporated assessment insights into the talent selection process. You have a pool of effective leaders capable of growing and adapting to maximally benefit your organization, whether it's in terms of performance or culture. Although you still have some core characteristics that you're going to need to work on an ongoing development. You know, no one's going to come in fully polished. You know, and again, similar to the replacement costs of turnover, you know, dollar figures associated with leadership development practices in particular can be found all over the place. To serve as an anchoring point, I'll use a Harvard Business Review estimate that organizations globally spend about 350 billion on leadership development efforts worldwide. So clearly this is big business. So with that, I'm going to follow up with another poll question for you, asking, do you have a leadership development program in your organization? Or if you're a consultant, do you do leadership development type work? Ian, go ahead and let me know when you see things kind of leveling out and where we end up standing.
Absolutely, lots of responses, and it's pretty evenly distributed, really. You know, we're looking at about 33% of respondents having a program, 23% having a series of programs, 28% having an informal approach to development, and at the lower end, about 16% with no program at all.
Okay, That's a great perspective, and certainly emphasizes the value. I mean, there is value to leadership development, and it also emphasizes the diversity of approaches that can be taken, whether it's a formal program, um, whether it makes sense to have a series of programs based on some key needs within your organization. And then, a lot of organizations do rely on informal approaches such as mentoring, um, and a selective job placement to ensure leadership development. So I'm going to go back to the numbers, and clearly, leadership development programs are employed in some regard widely throughout the world. We have one study from the Brandon Hall Group that showed that 75% of organizations um, question the effectiveness of their leadership development programs. And we certainly run into the issue in the HR world of how do we effectively measure effectiveness, but it also begs the question of what are those specific challenges that are leading to so many organizations questioning the effectiveness of leadership development programs. So again, I'm going to ask our audience to take a few moments and write some pain points that they see, some challenges that they see in their organizations into that questions box again. And Ian, feel free to kind of summarize some key points that you see.
Yeah, some of the themes we're seeing in terms of motivating employees to be goal-oriented. Also, in terms of the self-awareness aspect of things, that leaders may not see themselves as being poor leaders, right? And establishing relevant competency criteria. So going back to the characteristics or competencies of an effective leader. Really, really good comments here. Willingness to change as well.
Oh, great. Yeah, certainly relevant to today's world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, with that, and I think that dovetails awfully nicely with some. Again, since I have the microphone, I'm going to fixate on three core challenges that we've seen consistently, and again, like I said, dovetail nicely with a couple of the comments that Ian called out. So one of these fundamentally is, that change is hard. We're still close enough to the new year where a lot of us likely recall our New Year's resolutions, and I'm not going to make this a poll question, but it's likely safe to say that we, for the most part, have maybe come up a little short in fulfilling these resolutions. I'm not ashamed to say that I most definitely have. Um, Sustained behavior change is just fundamentally difficult. Even in the organizational world where there are incentives, growth and development in the right environment is encouraged and rewarded by promotions and pay increases. Nonetheless, sustained behavioral change is still a challenge. So, and again, my focus here is not only immediately but also long term. And so, again, going back to this idea that we've migrated as a field from focusing on concrete and relatively straightforward technical skills training and are now needing to focus on developing these soft skills, which are complex and are deeply ingrained. This is, again, where your expertise and your focus as an HR professional or consultant comes into play and is particularly critical. The CPI can, at this point, can continue to provide guidance around, what skills could be the focus of development and guidance around how to approach development of those skills. But we've often seen and organizations achieve success in this world by focusing development on, and this is the key point here, on specific observable behaviors that arise from these underlying personality characteristics measured by things like the CPI. So for a quick example, and I know we're pushing time here, is sociability, which is similar in how it's conceptualized to extroversion, which we're likely all familiar with. And if you're a consulting organization, it sounds great to offer a comprehensive leadership development program focused on a concept such as creativity or innovation, which is a very sophisticated and very complex topic. But it's really hard to move the needle on something that sophisticated. In contrast, if we focus on sociability, we can pick out simple behavioral and communication tips that are associated with it and can easily incorporate in. There's a focus in the learning and development world now on kind of bite-sized pieces of developmental information and nudging people along. And we can use these simple behavioral techniques to kind of push people to engage in these behaviors on a daily basis so that they become ingrained in their everyday work. And so while some components of leadership development can be applied across the board, typically development, especially at higher levels, is more individualized. So ongoing coaching and check-ins with the team are often used to address individual opportunities. And just as you used the CPI as a part of your toolkit for making hiring decisions, again, like I said, these results can also guide coaching conversations and provide activities, developmental activities that are very specific, very behaviorally oriented, and over time can become automatic, can become a habit. So the next challenge that I'm going to focus on is showing developmental progress. Again, if we're thinking of leadership development at this level being more individualized, is that ROI is really difficult to show. And another factor is that the realities of organizational life may really limit the ability to demonstrate strengths that the leader has learned. So I've talked about culture, and if someone's in a strong and positive, inclusive culture, they have ideally the opportunity to let those strengths shine. But if they're not in that culture, it may be that their head is down and they're in the weeds and they don't have a chance to show those developments that they learn, the development and the growth that they've learned in class or through e-learning or through these bite-sized bits in their everyday job. And so again, in HR, as you're able to help leaders kind of pull their head up from the weeds, they can see that fighting daily fires isn't necessarily advantageous, and focusing on these bigger picture issues and their own development is where you're going to see the greatest ROI. And then finally, I want to touch back on this idea of fads, and although there are some negative connotations there, they're not all bad by any means. And so growth mindset, like I said, is something that we can address in the CPI, and it's certainly a popular concept. Another concept that's kind of risen in popularity in recent years is grit. And it's something that, again, the CPI measures in scales of responsibility and self-control. So I can go back to this repeated theme of, as in HR, it's not necessarily that all fads are bad. It becomes, your challenge to identify which fads, have some basis, whether they are meaningfully different than things that you can already measure through more traditional tools that have a lot more psychometric data supporting their value. So finally, I'm going to jump through just a quick list of, here you'll see on your screen 6 of the 29 personality characteristics measured by the CPI. I've talked a lot about the value of personality, and I'm interested in getting a quick idea of where you see some value. So, the goal again is that the CPI provides an additional tool in your tool belt. It's a standardized way of measuring personality that gives you an additional data point for decision making. So as you think about these and just focusing on the definitions, or the word should be relatively self-explanatory. I'd throw up another poll that asks which one characteristic you see as most critical to effective leadership. Okay, and in the interest of time, I'm going to jump in, but it seems like we're floating pretty strongly toward the value of empathy, which has certainly grown in recent years. And you might have anticipated this, but the takeaway is that all of these have been demonstrated to be important to effective leadership. And so my apologies for having you pick just one. Um, but again, I also want to make sure that you consider, even within this list, which of those characteristics you might gain the most benefit in focusing on the selection side, and those which you might want to focus in on the developmental side of things. So as I wrap things up here, I want to just cover a few loose ends. One is that as a part of attending this webinar, we'll send you an ebook that kind of summarizes some of these critical competencies that I talked about. We'll also send you a sample coaching report for leaders that gets at some of those more concrete developmental areas. And then I also just want to throw a quick plug in that if you think there is potential value for the CPI in your organization, and would like to learn more about it, and would like to become certified in its use, we do have an upcoming certification program in Sunnyvale on March 4th through 6th. So that's something that you can explore if you think that'll add value for you. So finally, kind of key takeaways. Again, I've really hit home that what do you want to buy versus what do you want to build? I think assessment can play a very critical role in understanding the cultural values of your organization and making sure that you're hiring for that fit, or to the extent that your cultural values are being developed and are evolving, you can use the assessments, or you can use assessment to help achieve those aspirational values. And then again, of course, you have this balance between focusing on your talent pipeline and what are current strengths and opportunities for the role that you're hiring for, but also how is this person going to contribute to your organization down the road. So again, back on you as HR professionals and consultants as some critical issues to think about as you go about your work. So finally, my voice has, I think, mostly survived, and I'll pass it over to Ian for questions. If you have any questions, feel free to type in to that question box, and with the couple minutes remaining, we'll get to what we can.
Great, thanks, Justin. I'll move rather quickly in the 2 minutes we have left. And one question I'll highlight here, Justin, for you is, do we recommend that candidates take the CPI when interviewing for a position? And they reference that they know that the MBTI is not intended to be used as a recruiting and selection tool.
Yeah, so I would generally, as a general rule of thumb, I would stay away from using the MBTI as a part of the selection process. There may be circumstances in which having that perspective, and if the MBTI is heavily ingrained in your organization, it can provide a useful perspective in the background. But ultimately, from a legal defensibility standpoint, if there is a charge that comes your way, you'll have to demonstrate as an organization that you weren't using the MBTI results to heavily influence your selection decisions. And so ultimately, we see the MBTI as a developmental tool. And once you have someone on board, it can really help, one, provide that common language for understanding self and others, and then really fuel, be another data point, and I keep referring to this, additional tool in your tool belt for fueling growth and development.
Terrific. Yeah, thanks, Justin. And there are a lot of additional questions coming in. I see we're at the top of the hour. So unfortunately, we've run out of time, but we're going to follow up with each individual that's submitted a question, and follow up with all of you, of course, to provide a link to the recording and the slides. And as Justin mentioned, a sample report of the CPI and the ebook as well. So some good stuff coming in follow-up. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for participating, and Justin for walking everyone through the CPI and its applications. So thanks everyone, and have a great day.